coming, guys. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Camilo Mora. He's had quite an interesting career. He spent 8 years as a postdoc with the Census of Marine Life, and that took him all over Smithsonian and SCRIPPS and a number of different places. He's now an assistant professor at the University of Hawaii. He's going to be talking to us today about biodiversity loss. So, Camilo?
Thank you very much. Well, it is really an honor to be doing this presentation, and it's also a very special event for me because today my life has completed a cycle. That cycle took me 18 years. I was here 18 years ago, and I was a grad student, and it was a massive gambling to come here. My family is from a very poor background. My mom sold her car, my dad got into debt, but they said, you know what, you have to go to Australia. The whole thing got started because I read a paper by Benwood. That was long time ago. Not too. David is not here. Okay, good, because I don't mean to imply that he's all already. But yes, so I came here. The first thing I do, I went and knocked at his door, and I said to him, you know what? I came all around the world because I want to do a master's with you, and my English was terrible at that time. Not that it's any better now, but that conversation was terrible. And then he said to me, well, you have to wait for like 12 months to see if you can get a scholarship. And I was already stuck here for 6 months. And I couldn't get into here. However, I came here to realize that the future of that dream was on the other side of the world. Because when I was here, I met Peter Sell, who told me, you know what, you have to come and work with me, which I did. But being here was pretty special because I got a couple of attributes of being in this place. One, it is strive for publication. And the other one was this motivation to get big things. And that kind of set my shape to do the research that I'm about to show you. This is the summary of about 10 works as part of the Census of Marine Life. I want to clarify that I'm not gonna go into the details of every single project. We're gonna be covering the generalities of the multiple papers that were published there. The general conclusion of this paper is that we're losing biodiversity like crazy. I have multiple alternative titles to this presentation. This is one of the titles that I have been coming around. Biodiversity loss unstoppable with current biodiversity conservation strategies. I use this title as well, ecosystem health equals to the inverse of people times consumption, or simply, we're screwing it. You're going to see why I get to that point. Before I get started, I want to put this situation of the loss of biodiversity, the global loss of biodiversity loss into context. And this is the context that I usually use. As far as we know, we are alone on the universe. Today, there are about 100 billion planets that look like planet Earth. Of those, we know that about 10 of them have the characteristics of planet Earth. That means that the probability of us finding another planet like planet Earth is 1 in 1 billion. Let me put this number in context. Does anyone knows here, anyone who has won the national lottery at least once? Nobody, right? That probability is 1 in 200 million. Finding another planet is like a person winning the national lottery 5 times in a row. That's how rare finding another planet like planet Earth is. So, in contrast to the loneliness of the universe, it turns out that we share this planet with about 8.7 million species. We get a lot of things from these species: air, water, food, recreation, medicine. The total cost around $33 trillion a year. Unfortunately, this massive asset that is biodiversity, and that is very unique as far as we know, is being destroyed. What is the magnitude of this destruction of biodiversity? Today, there are certain things that we know. For instance, when you look at the total number of species in the planet, there is a massive debate where we are, how many species are there? The total number today is estimated to be between 8 million and 5 million species. That's something that we know, although there is a huge range there. We also know from prior studies that if you wipe out 70% of the species on the planet, that's classified as a mass extinction event. In the history of planet Earth, there have been about 5 of those. Okay? Now, if you go through the literature and look at all rates of extinction from multiple papers, this is the rate of extinction that you ended up coming with. They range from 72 0.72% per year to 0.2% per year, right? So as you can see, if things keep going the way they are, by about sometime within the next century, the rate of extinction of a species today could be classified easily as a mass extinction event. This is something that has happened only 5 times in the history of the planet. Now, another interesting and pretty sad state of affairs is the fact that many of these species are disappearing and we don't even know that they are disappearing. Today, the rate of description of the species is calculated to be on the edge of about 8,000 species a year. That's how many species we describe every year. Meaning that only by about 2180, we will be in a place in which we will know all the species that are standing in that time. However, by that time, we will have lost over 60% of the species in the planet. The magnitude of this biodiversity loss shouldn't be underestimated. This is what is happening. This thing is very well documented. We are taking these ecosystems that had a lot of species and turning those ecosystems into ecosystems, places that had no species whatsoever. The magnitude of this change is very well documented. 100% of the world's oceans affected by human activities, 83% of the world land affected by human activities, 6 million hectares of forest lost every year, global mangroves, we lost 3 million hectares since 1980. Seagrasses, 130 kilometers square per year lost. Coral reefs declined 80% in the Caribbean, 1.1% per year in the Indo-Pacific, and the list just goes on and on and on. I don't think there is any doubt of the magnitude of this change. Unfortunately, what is very worrisome about this situation of the loss of biodiversity is the fact that many of these changes will be irreversible. The reason for that is actually a concept that has been described multiple times, and it's this idea of the alternative equilibrium state. Basically, what happens here is that a species or a population is adapted to live on a given environment. The life histories are adapted to the environment and to interactions with other species. When you stress that population, the life histories are going to change as a result of adapting to these new conditions. Of course, what ended up happening there is that you lose genetic diversity. Once you lose those genes are not going to go back, right? As a result, the species or the populations try to stabilize the populations at newer levels, and as a result, it's very hard to return those ecosystems to the states in which they were initially. And that is what makes this situation very critical, is that many of these changes, even if later on we realize it's important to protect or to revert these things, it will be already too late. Of course, with the loss of biodiversity, there are going to be a lot of goods and services that are going to be impaired. For us in the first world, and I now, thanks God, I am in that group, it's not really a big issue. However, we had 1 billion people that was hungry every day. Just think about this number, 1 billion people, and what that number means. What that number means is that these people are living in environments that are so depleted that they cannot provide the food that these people need. And here's some more statistics. A person dies every second as a result of malnutrition, and a child under the age of 5 every 5 seconds, again, as a result of not having enough food. So this is what is happening. We are taking up these ecosystems from states that look like this to states that look like this. This doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense for me for 2 main reasons. The first one is that we're destroying a vital asset. As I pointed out before, there are multiple goods and services that we obtain from that. And secondly, we have nowhere else to go. This goes back to the initial slide that I was showing there. There is not a plan B. This planet goes wrong, there is nowhere else we can go, right? So today, one of the biggest challenges for us ecologists is that question. How do we ensure the maintenance of biodiversity? That's, in my opinion, one of the biggest questions that we are faced today. Multiple people suggest that for you to achieve this, you need to have protection. You need to have some kind of protection of those ecosystems so that they can be sustained over time. However, for you to generate this protection, you need to have some basic science. one of the key elements that you need to have from a science is to understand the causality of the threats. What is causing biodiversity loss? Is it overfishing? Is it climate change? Is it pollution? You need to resolve that because it turns out that there are different interest groups that are going to be impacted depending on who is responsible for this situation, right? So figuring out this piece of knowledge will allow you to first set up protection strategies that are going to be effective, but also it's going to minimize the potential conflicts that it could generate. Finally, the other piece of information that you need is to understand patterns of biodiversity and the drivers of that biodiversity. The reason for that is that we need to be aware that there is conscious, that there is never going to be enough money to protect every single place that we want to protect. So as a result, we need to prioritize those resources that are very limited into the places that we know are going to be maintaining these patterns. So, this long introduction is because if you were to look at my record of publication, they are all over the place. We do papers on microcosm experiments all the way up to whales. So if you were to look at those papers independently, you would think, what's wrong with this guy? I mean, he's pulling out papers all over the place. However, what I do with those papers, every one of those papers is contextualized in one of these components. And what I'm going to do now for the rest of the presentation is give you some highlights of the different papers that have been done addressing or filling out these gaps that are on every one of those components. Let me get started here with the diversity and their drivers. Here we have been focusing on two main questions. The first question is how many species are there? And the second question is where are those species and why are they there? Right? Let me tell you something about the research that we have done regarding this first question. When you were to look at how many species are there on the planet, of course what you start doing is putting together all of the species that have been already described. When you do that, this is the pattern that you obtain. This is the year, this is the number of species, and as you can see, the number of species described every year is on the rise. About 1.5 million species have been described so far. About 8,000 species are described every year. But as you can see, we are not really an asymptote on this curve. So directly, we don't know how many species are there, right? That means that you have to rely on an alternative method to calculate how many species are there. One of the big no-nos about presentations is never put a lot of letters on a slide. Right? But I violate that rule to show you the summary of our entire knowledge on how many species are there in this single slide. This slide summarizes all we know about how many species are there. It's a contrast between the study that proposes the method and the limitations that somebody else made to that method, right? So for every method that has been proposed, somebody has found a limitation to the method. In some cases, actually, it's very interesting, this table, because here you can see, for instance, Robert May proposing this method, and about 10 years later, himself criticized his own method. Just to give you a sense of how difficult answering that question is. So, when you take into account all of the data that has been pulled out together, all of the methods that are available, it turns out that we just don't know how many species are there. The range that has been proposed is anything between 3 million and 100 million species, right? So it turns out that as part of the Census of Marine Life, they put a lot of people together to answer that question. How many species are there in the ocean? And we went to the Royal History Museum in London. I was there hanging out with these very high-poor scientists. They write this letter, fantastic letter, one of the most beautiful letters. And they wrote to Nature saying, you know what? We can't answer this question. This is a massive question, doesn't have an answer, and we feel strong that we can answer this question. So yeah, we wrote a letter to the editor of Nature, and the editor of Nature, of course, responded by saying, yeah, okay, you go ahead, do it. Right? That, of course, brought some additional motivation to get this work done on time. And by we, I mean me, spent about 2 years collecting all kinds of data to test different methods and see if the numbers that you get are reliable or not. I collected data on body size frequency distributions, accumulation curves, diversity ratios, and for every one of those sources of data, there was a limitation that prevented you of getting a good number from that. And after about 1 year of working at that, we ended up writing a letter to Nature with the tail between our legs, saying to the editor of Nature, you know what, sorry, we couldn't do it. The reason why this question hasn't been answered is simply because it's just pretty hard to answer that question. So I started working on another project on the deep sea. And then I found this paper by Ricotta. This paper, I mean, the chances of me finding this paper are so rare. This paper is 2 pages long. It was written in 2002. It has been cited twice by Ricotta himself. So, but I was working on something else, and then this figure flashed on my eyes, and I look at it. I said, maybe this is something that I could use for the global scale analysis that we just finished with no output whatsoever. So it was 11 in the morning when I saw this figure, and I figured, you know what? I spent already a year on this project. Nothing came out of it. Just going to waste 2 more hours. If by noon this method doesn't give me any results, I just keep going on. So I did have all the data already collected. I organized it, the whole thing, and I did a prediction for birds, right, with this new method. This method simply ranks the higher taxonomy, species, genus, family that are in a place against how many taxa are in those groups. Then you get a linear model, and then you predict the total number of species at a higher level. So I did that for birds, and I know already, everybody knows that there are about 10,000 species of birds, right? So you cannot imagine the anxiety, my anticipation to see this number. So I was about to click enter. You know, if there was a 10,000, I was in business. If there were not 10,000 species out of this method, then I was just wasting 2 more hours of my life there. So bang, I click enter, and boom, 10,000 species. This method was predicting 10,000 species for birds. So I figured, okay, maybe this is just a random thing. So I tried mammals, which are about 6,000, and boom, 6,000. I get all excited. I email the co-authors, and I say, I found this method, man. It's giving us very good results for the species that we already know, and the species are there. So right away, we emailed to Nature. Nature, we just did it. We just found a method that gives you how many species are there, and this is the first method that can be validated. And Nature's response was, sorry, we don't want it anymore. So this is what I was telling you about how good the method is. So this is, in this axis, you have how many species are there on actual taxonomy groups, and this is the number of species predicted by our method. We have about 13 taxonomy groups that we know very well how many species are there. This line is the one-to-one relationship. You can see that the slope of this scale is 1, meaning that it's not really different of being along that axis there. So, of course, once we got the method, we apply this method to all major kingdoms of life on Earth. What we ended up discovering here, for instance, in Animalia, the method predicts almost 8 million species, of which about 2 million are in the ocean. For chromates, about 5,000 species, about 1,000 species live on the ocean. In total, our method predicted 8.9 million species on Earth, of which 2.2 million are on the ocean. What is interesting about these numbers have different implications. The first implication is that every year, about 6,000 species are described. I said before 8,000. There has been a modification since we got this paper, but that's the average when we publish this paper. So this is the average for the last 20 years, 6,000 species. That means that for you to describe the species that are left, at this pace, it will take us 1,200 years. 1,200 years to describe the species that are left on the planet. It has been estimated that the total cost of describing one species is $48,000 per species. I mean, describing a species is not cheap. Meaning that to describe the species that are left, you will have to invest $364 billion. And a taxonomy, on average, describes 25 species in a life. Right? This is the people that dedicates to describe a species, they describe on average 25 species in their lives. Meaning that for you to describe the species that are left, you will need an army of 300,000 taxonomies. Let me move on now to this other component of my research, which is where the species and why are they there. This is another question for which we just don't really have a good answer for it. If you were to look at the literature on global patterns on biodiversity, these are the papers that you find. This paper in Nature, based on 10,000 species. This paper published in Nature, based on 20,000 species. This one in the Science, 1,000 species. This one in Nature, 40 species. This one in Nature, 30 species. Right? There are two elements that I wanted to highlight on this slide. The first one is the milestones that these papers have represented, which is indicated here by the fact that all of these papers have been published in either Nature and Science. First thing. The second thing is the number of species that are based on these maps. As you can see here, in total, the global pattern of biodiversity is based on no more than 50,000 species. We already know that there are 1.4 million species that have been described, yet our global understanding of biodiversity is based on no more than 40 or 50,000 species. So, this was another big question that the Census of Marine Life decided to address. Where are those species? So, for that, we collected data from everywhere. We digitalized maps from different sources, and we ended up generating these geographical ranges for about 4,000 to 5,000 species. In 2008, we developed a new method to calculate how many species are on specific places based on the temporal record of description of species on those places. So, let me explain briefly what that is. This program takes all the records on a given place, generates an accumulation curve. You feed multiple mathematical models. You do some kind of weighted average there based on an AIC, and then you calculate the expected number of species. Right? So from this method, you can calculate how many species are there at specific places, and with this data, you can just simply overlap those ranges on given over those cells and calculate how many species overlap the ranges on a given cell. We combine these two sources of data, and after about 1 year, we documented patterns for 13 taxonomy groups, and that paper was published in Nature in 2010. This is, now let me move on. The third question here is why are those species where they are? I'm not going to spend too much time into the mechanisms, processes that explain those patterns, but we have explored multiple hypotheses. We have explored the effect of area, the mid domain, habitat isolation, temperature dispersal, and last year we tested also the neutral theory on some assemblages. We are also looking into the effect of dispersal. These are, for instance, some of the simulations that we are running, which is real-time dispersal of particles from every single coral reef in the world. And with these simulations, we are able to figure out the patterns of connectivity and the time that it takes for these species to disperse to those places. We have analyzed patterns at the scale of the Caribbean, the scale of the Eastern Pacific, Indian and Pacific, tropical, and just very recently, we developed the skills and had the analytical capabilities to analyze these patterns at a global scale. We already had 3 of those papers published. So, after about 2 years of work, we contributed global patterns for biodiversity on 13,000 more species. Meaning that the global scale yet, or global understanding of biodiversity, or where are those species, is based on probably 60,000 species. One of the standing questions there is, where are the remaining 8 million species that we know are there? I'm just waiting for the right student to come to my lab and start working on this kind of, answering these kind of questions. We had already about 250 million records that we hope to use for some kind of simulation programs that we have developed to hopefully provide the first global map of where are the species on this planet. Let me move on now to the second component of my research, which is on the causality of the threats. Here we have tried multiple things from microcosm experiments. Here we take invertebrates, put them into these vials. We maintain them over time, ensuring that their populations remain stable. Then we expose these things to warming, these populations to warming, harvesting, or habitat loss, and then we monitor the size of these populations. And what we are finding here is that when you combine three of these factors, there is a synergistic decline on these populations. It was kind of obvious, but we need to have some kind of demonstration of how these different factors interact. This paper was published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society. We have also done meta-analysis. Here we have been looking at the density of multiple taxa and finding out how they relate to different human stressors. This is just one of the few examples. Here we analyze the density of sharks in the Caribbean. This is about 100,000 observations. And in this map, you can see red, meaning no sharks, blue, meaning a lot of sharks. So again, red meaning very bad, blue meaning very good, just like the US politics. I'm glad that there are Democrats in this room, man. I make this same joke in Alabama for a job interview, and the poor people was dead quiet. And I just didn't think that you will find academics that will be Republicans. So of course nobody laughed at my joke there. And to make matters even worse, I say, so what? Now you are all Republicans now? And of course a presentation from their own, which So yeah, so this is a pattern of density of sharks in the Caribbean. What is very fascinating about this pattern is the fact that in the Caribbean you have 0 sharks when you have more than 1 human. I mean, this is how strong that pattern is. You put a human being on a coral reef and sharks just disappear. Or on the contrast, you have any kind of density of sharks where there is 0 humans. The only outliers are Bahamas and some of these places where there are very strong regulations on the catching of sharks. So that's one of the analyses that we have been doing regarding the effect of overfishing. Recently, we have been moving towards understanding the effect of climate change. For this, we have compiled all of the different models of the IPCC as part of the CIAP5. Right now, if you go, well, it's not really open yet because we're expecting the paper to be published. Our lab has this kind of simulation for every single model that has been done so far. So pretty much you come and click play, and what you're going to be seeing here is the flashing of temperature change between the year that is shown here compared to 2000. Right? For instance, on this map, you can see that everything was kind of blue in 1850 compared to 2000, right? So you just go there to my webpage and then you click play. And you can see, and this is the global average here. So you can see there are some pockets of cold places. And as soon as what I want you to look at is when you hit 2000. So now you can see how now places start warming up. According to this model, for the year 2100, the global average of the ocean will be increased by about 3 degrees. This is just one of 40 models that we had. For every model, we had 3 scenarios, 100 years, 12 months, 364 days. In total, we are talking 60 million global maps. We had like 3 terabyte hard drives completely full with these maps. And that we had that for each of 12 environmental variables, not only temperature, but oxygen, productivity, pH, and we are also working on land as well. So this is the first paper that we produced with this analysis. It's currently in review in PLOS Biology. It got rejected in Nature, but hopefully it goes through in PLOS Biology. What we have done here, this is the global, the total change that will happen between 2005 and 2100 in temperature, oxygen, pH, and phytoplankton productivity. What we have done, we have scaled every one of these changes from 0 to 1 to have like a composite map of climate change stress. Right? So we put all of these maps together on this map. The scale of this map goes from 4, meaning that the largest change in all variables happened there, or 0, meaning that not a single one of the 4 variables that go into this map they had a change, right? So one of the things that we did once we did that was to overlap that with the marine ecosystems of the world and the hotspots of biodiversity as well. And we rank everything here at 0. So if you are below that, that means that you are either going to be warming, you are going to have oxygen reduction, pH is going to go down, and productivity is going to go down as well. So as you can see on multiple ecosystems in the world, pretty much every single ecosystem in the world will have changes in climate change in more than one parameter. Right? That's kind of the point that we wanted to make with this paper, is the fact that there is a huge potential for synergistic responses on these ecosystems because there are more than one parameter changing on the same places. So this is the 0, and as you can see, all of the ecosystems are below that line. We multiply that by people as well. What you ended up finding after doing this thing is that at the global scale, there are 1.4 billion people that live on places that will be highly impacted by climate change. Highly impacted meaning climate change scores larger than 2.3 in our general scale. Of that, almost 700 million have high dependency on the ocean. That means 60% of the total animal consumption, working force, or domestic product come from the ocean. And of that, 407 million people are poor. So this is kind of the people that is going to be truly hammered by climate change because they live on places where climate change is going to be strong, they have high dependency of the ocean, and they are poor. That is just for the low emission scenario. When you analyze the high emission scenario, the total number of people that could be on that level of vulnerability is close to 900 million people. Where is this thing going? Our attempt has been to provide a global assessment of the different drivers that will affect biodiversity. And that is very hard because there are so many variables, all of them interacting, that making experiments makes these things very, very hard. So one of the things that I have been doing recently is this kind of review analysis, trying to generate these models in which you have the multiple drivers, how they interact with each other, how they drive populations down, and try to put papers to every one of these components. And that is, I had a couple of papers on this. One of the papers is a book chapter that just came out this year. So that's all of the work that we have been doing regarding the causality of threats. Now let me move on to the last component of the research, which is biodiversity protection. Here, I have been focusing on two main strategies of biodiversity protection: protect areas and the management of fisheries. I'm going to give you a couple case studies here. This is one of the first papers that we did, trying to understand how good are the protected areas in the world that have coral reefs on them. This paper took me about probably like 3 days to complete. The reason being that the protected areas of the world are available in the internet. I collaborated with this guy called Serge Anderfuet. I don't know if you know him, but he digitalized all of the coral reefs in the world. He gave me his database. In GIS, I overlapped these two maps and determined that at the global scale, there are about 1,400 protected areas that have coral reefs, and they cover 21% of the world's corals. And I thought that was the paper. I was ready. I mean, it took me like 3 days to get this thing done. I thought this is going to be the quickest paper of my life. I sent it to my co-authors, and all of them were just like, not so fast. It turns out that there was a huge problem with this database on the protected areas, right? Because many countries send these polygons to the IUCN or to the United Nations where this database is storage, but you don't know if they are real or not, and also you don't know if they are good or not. It might be there, but is the government really enforcing these protected areas or not? So that turned out to be a nightmare to figure out that. Those two questions: how accurate is the database, and how effective are the protected areas? So one thing that I decided to do was, you know what? I know that there have to be coral reef scientists in every single one of these countries. So I spent about 2 months looking in the internet for experts from those countries, right? So I created this database of 1,000 people. I had their phone numbers and their emails. And what I did was very simple. I just wrote a message, an email to them saying to them, you know what, I have these protected areas in this country. Could you please answer whether they are there and how effective they are? So I sent that email to 1,000 people. The server of the university collapsed within 5 minutes of me sending this email. I get an email from IT services saying, what's going on with that computer on that lab? It completely crashed our server. And I was just like, no, let the emails go, man, I'm working here. And the guy was just like, no way, we're going to put a limit to how many emails you can send from that computer to like 50 emails. This is 2005 and it's New Zealand. The internet wasn't great those days. So it took me probably like a month to email all of these people, right? Every day I was emailing 50 people. and I didn't even want to look at my inbox to see the responses that I was getting because I wanted to finish the project first. And after about 1 or 2 months of sending emails like crazy, and you can imagine the excitement that I was working with because I had these 2 huge databases, a potentially huge paper, so I was very excited sending all of those emails, and after 2 months of waiting for those emails, I only got 5 replies. So, make a guess why I got so few replies. Well, the first one is language. You assume that everybody speaks English, and that's a big mistake when you analyze Spanish at the global scale. So, what I ended up doing, I repeated the whole thing. And this one time, we communicated with these people in 5 different languages. And there are, of course, people that even if you email them in the right language, they're just not going to answer. So what we ended up doing was calling them. Calling these people was one of the most fascinating stories that I have had in my entire life. The reason for that, because it gave me a first experience of what these people is facing in the field, right? And there were a lot of different stories about communicating with these people. And one of them is this woman from China. So you can imagine this conversation between a woman from China that doesn't speak English and a guy from Colombia that doesn't speak English either. Right? And we want to get an answer to our question. And she wanted to be helpful, but she was not being helpful. Right? So this conversation drags on for like an hour, and I realized I'm not going to get the data that I need from this lady. And I was trying to cut the conversation because another thing that happens is that you need to keep track of time differences. Right? Because you want to get a person in Africa from where I was, you need to call this person at 3 in the morning. Right? So at the time, I wanted to call New Caledonia, and it was about to be 4 o'clock in New Caledonia, so I needed to finish that conversation with that lady from China. And then I finished the conversation. It was the most expensive phone call. The most expensive phone call of the entire project, and I didn't get any single data from that lady. So I called New Caledonia. But before calling the country, I was used to look at the web pages to see what language they speak, right? And I go and look at these web pages and New Caledonia, French, and I was just like, oh no, French, man. I went from Chinese to French. So I called the New Caledonia people, and this one answers the phone. Institute of Marine Science, how may I help you? And I say to her, excuse me, do you speak English? And she said to me, I'm speaking in English to you, sir. So my brain was so saturated with the conversation from the girl from China that I didn't realize that this woman in New Caledonia was already talking to me in English. So I started laughing, and of course this woman didn't take me seriously, so I couldn't get any data from New Caledonia. So as I said, however, we were able to communicate with all of these people, and we were able to validate every single protected area in the world that had coral reefs that year. We deleted 521 protected areas to the database. We added 527 new protected areas. Our estimate now came to be 18.7% of the world's coral reefs are inside protected areas. But what is valuable about this paper was the fact that we were able to discriminate these according to how effective that protection is. What we ended up finding is that of these 18.7%, only 1.4% are inside non-take protected areas. Of that, only 0.1% is non-take, and people respect the laws of the protected area, meaning that there is no poaching. And of that, 0.01% are coral reefs that are inside protected areas that are not take, have no poaching, and have no external risk. This is how effective the global protection of coral reefs is as a result of protected areas. So my boss was Ransom Myers, and this guy was very ambitious. Everything that you say to him, the first thing that he will say to you is you have to go global with this thing. So after we finished the coral reefs, we wanted to do all of the protected areas in the world, which are 100,000 of them. So I figured, no, there's no way we can get this data verified directly from these people. So what we ended up doing was a different type of analysis. Here, you can see the area of land and ocean that is covered by protected areas. As you can see, there has been a huge increase on the area that is covered by protected areas, and I think that's a response of a lot of governments being very concerned about the loss of biodiversity loss, and they see this as the only strategy that they can use to prevent biodiversity loss. However, if you were to look at different metrics of how biodiversity is doing, what you ended up finding is that biodiversity is going down. This is not to say that protected areas are driving biodiversity loss. This is to say that the massive increase in protected areas is not coping with the challenge of reverting the loss of biodiversity. This paper got rejected in Science because they argue that this was just too big of a scale. That the global scale, of course, you're going to find this kind of pattern. So, of course, we took that comment very seriously, and we decided to explore this same pattern for coral reefs, which are the most protected ecosystem in the world, and the pattern is the same. This is the area of coral reefs that is covered by protected areas over time. This is the trend of coral cover on those different regions. We did that for the Caribbean and the Indo-Pacific. So the pattern is the same. The conclusion, in my opinion, is that the challenge of biodiversity loss is too big to be fixed with protected areas. This is another project that we did, and here we move to the second component, which is the management of the world's fisheries. We did a review of the literature on how every country will manage their own fisheries. We realized that the process starts with having a scientist. Those scientists generate recommendations that are passed to policymakers, they make the regulations, and somebody goes and implements those regulations. And the output of this cascade determines how effective your management is. So for every one of these different components, we had a different question. We put that on the internet. We sent the survey to peer review to a lot of different experts to see if perhaps we were missing some elements on this process that we were not considering. We spent about 1 year collecting the contact information of fishery experts on every single country. We collected data for 15,000 people. This is the number of people that was inquired about this specific project. We put all of those responses together, and we generated a general score of how well a given country is managing their own fisheries. Again, you are dealing with people here, so you can get all kinds of responses. You know, people that is very nice, people that is pretty nasty. And of course, we made mistakes. One of the things that we were doing to pull out the contact information of these people were to go to these international meetings. But of course, sometimes you pull out people from those places that have no ocean, right? And this was one of those mistakes. So we sent an email to this guy who was living in Slovakia, and we asked him if he could please fill this survey of the marine fisheries of his country. You know, so the guy, well, we don't even have an ocean, why are you doing emailing me this thing? So he sent me this map in his account. This is the funniest email that I got, and he sent me this thing, and this is what he wrote in his email. Slovenia and Slovakia doomed to forever be messed up. You know? To be fair, I didn't know any one of those two countries up to that day. So I got to learn some geography there. So after putting all of those scores together, every single country got a score between worst and best. Best meaning the best score on all of the different criteria, and worst, of course, meaning the opposite. What you're going to see right now is the management for all the countries in the world. The United States doing relatively well. They have good enforcement and good science. Africa is by far one of the worst countries. It's unfortunate what is happening on all of these countries in Africa. They have nothing there. And to me, what is even worse, they are selling fishing rights to countries in Europe and Asia to come and fish in their water. So those people, those boats go and fish there with no oversight of any kind. Australia ranking pretty well. Australia always ranked pretty well on all of the different assessments that we have done. Countries in the South Pacific doing relatively well. those countries are actually very interesting because it's not that they have a good management in place, but it's just that they are not fishing that much as other countries are. And that right there is the average management of the world fisheries. So this is the summary of the whole work that we have been doing. As you can see, our understanding of patterns of biodiversity and the drivers of biodiversity is still precarious. Regarding our understanding of the causality of threats, we still had a lot to learn. Regarding protection, the different assessments that we have done indicate that the management of these natural resources is inappropriate, and unfortunately, we have 1 billion people waiting for food. So, what's the stress? What is the title of this presentation about? We start panicking about this situation. This is my argument for why we should start panicking, and this is the last slide of this presentation. This is a pretty simple scenario. These are the different projections of human population. You were to multiply the number of people. Do you know how many people is there in the planet today? 7 billion people. The average per capita consumption of a human being today is 2.1 global hectares. Right? So the total productivity of 2.1 hectares is what a person on average consumes today. There is a huge range on that. People in Saudi Arabia consume the productivity of 12 hectares, and people in Haiti consume the productivity of 0.6. You don't really want to be in either one of those two extremes, right? But you want to be at 2.1. 2.1 is enough energy to sustain a human being. So another thing that we calculated is the biocapacity of the planet. The biocapacity of the planet has been estimated on 11 billion hectares. This is how much the planet can produce sustainably, right? So if you were to multiply 7 billion people that we already know are there by 2.1 hectares, that gives you over 14 billion hectares. But the planet can only produce 11, right? So it turns out that we already had a deficit. And that deficit started in the 1980 to 1990. That's when the human population surpassed what the planet can produce. And after that year, we started something that is called a status of overshot. This is consuming more than what the planet can produce. If you were to accumulate this amount of productivity that we consume every year, you ended up with this figure here that is called an ecological debt. We estimated that the total ecological debt will be equal to about 27 planet Earths by 2050. This is the ecological deficit that humanity will have by 2050 if everything remains the same as we are today. And with that, I finish my presentation. Thank you very much and have a good day.
So looking at your seminar there, you might pretty easily come to the conclusion that we need to control the population, but no one ever discusses it. Yeah. And I'm wondering what it's like in the place where you come from your experience, because here Australia's paying people to have babies, and no one ever talks, and no one wants to talk about population control. So I'm wondering what your experience is about.
Oh no, I came to the same conclusion, and it's funny that you say that thing, because one of the things that I started doing about 2 or 3 years ago was to write a paper about the issue of overpopulation and why is that we are not dealing with it. And there are multiple avenues at the global scale in which overpopulation should be talked about, but people is not talking about that. And on that paper, I outline point by point the evidence that is there to suggest how overpopulation is a major issue. This paper has been rejected about 10 times, and people just hate the idea of overpopulation. And it's very funny because a lot of my colleagues have read that paper and they say that that paper is pretty risky for me to publish because it could potentially jeopardize how people see me. So I don't know what the hell is the deal with overpopulation, but I agree with you. Sean?
So this is just a question about the global diversity estimation. So I read with some interest a long sequence of comments on the PLOS website about microbial diversity.
Yes. Yeah.
So I guess my question is, what do you think? Do you think that the criticisms that were made of the microbial diversity estimates are valid, or do you think they're overstated? If they are valid, do you think any of them would apply to the the eukaryotic diversity work? Are there particular groups you think might be more severely underestimated than others?
Yes, well, unfortunately, this paper got to be so big that I don't think many people read that paper in full. It turns out that we did all of those kind of sensitivity tests on those kind of issues. Like, for instance, the fact that bacterial microbial biodiversity is not well known. The supplements, we had a supplement specifically pointing out the fact that the microbial biodiversity is not really well understood, and as a result, those numbers need to be taken with care. So we make the caution there that those numbers are not to be trusted completely. The reason why we throw those numbers there was the fact that we wanted to generate some kind of motivation or interest to start improving that data. Because our alternative was to simply just say, you know what, we didn't analyze bacterial biodiversity. Our choice was to put the number there and caution that the numbers are not to be trusted completely and that some improvement in the data needs to be done. However, the other extreme that these people talk was that there are millions of species of bacteria, and I don't agree with that extreme view either. The reason for that is that bacteria are very interesting because they have this thing called horizontal gene transfer. And what happens, let's imagine the diversification of vertebrates, right? So you have fish on one end and you have birds on the other end, or perhaps mammals. So fish and mammals, right? You cannot cross those two lineages. Those lineages have been separated for so long that they are so different that they cannot really cross. In bacteria, you can take the same scenario, two species that have been isolated by the same amount of time, put them together and they will still reproduce. Right? So the issue of horizontal gene transfer means that for you to have species of bacteria, you really need to go very, very deep into their evolutionary history, meaning that you won't have as many species of bacteria as you would think for other eukaryotes. So that's kind of my issue with that thing. I don't think there are as many species as they think, but I also agree and I recognize that our numbers are perhaps low. And we recognize that in the paper. And very likely the answer to that question is going to be somewhere in between those two extremes there. Yes?
I've got a quick question. From I guess, an up-and-coming scientist and just somebody that's getting into the field, you've shown and documented a lot of declines. And I guess where's the hope for the next generation of scientists? Because a lot of times we just hear these horror stories, basically, of what's going on. And where do you get the motivation to wake up and go and try to make some improvements in the world?
I mean, to be honest with you, I get into the same thing, but my hope is that we will find an answer that will fix this problem. And that's the reason why we keep doing research. That's the reason why, for instance, the project that George is running is something that I'm very interested on, because I think that potentially we could find out exactly what is from us that makes us so damaging to the biodiversity, and perhaps that will give at least some opportunity to people to start even changing their own behaviors, or for governments or NGOs or whatever to start funding those kind of situations that lead to biodiversity loss. So the hope is there. And I think that this thing will change very quickly. And the reason for that is my appreciation of what happened in the US with the election of Barack Obama. That single thing gave me so much hope, because for me, that's something that told me that you can change these things very quickly if you get a lot of people surrounding a specific goal. So I have hope, and I think it's just a matter of finding what the real solution is and then trying to gather people around that solution. So it's not to be completely discouraged.
Yeah, sort of following on from that, you said that obviously MPAs or protected areas are not particularly effective in mitigating biodiversity loss. What would be, what do you think would be, do you have any suggestions of strategies that may be more effective?
If I were to have all of that money, given my reading of the literature, I would take all of that money and put it into family planning and women empowerment. That would be a long-term solution to this thing. Of course, a lot of people here is probably going to look at me ugly, but that's what I will do. I saw another.
Yeah, just following on those notes, I was wondering what efforts you make to get your research out beyond the scientific community.
We do a lot of effort into that. One of the things that we do there is the press releases. That's as far as we go with this thing. we have learned a lot to communicate this science to the general public. Keep in mind that this is something that every scientist should do, but unfortunately, one of the situations that happens there is that it generates these ego fights. And you start having a very hard time getting those papers published, mostly because, in my opinion, people start getting this like jealousy, and all of that, in my opinion, is triggered by the fame that these press releases do if they get picked up by the press. But yeah, we take the risk, and that's as far as we go. By the way, if you are interested, another thing that I'm doing now for my undergrad courses, we are developing these courses in which the students have to do a 1-minute TV commercial, in which they try to highlight an environmental issue in a very funny way. And the idea of that is to hopefully reach out a lot of people with some subliminal environmental information on it. We have the videos on our webpage. They're hilarious. Some of them are pretty cool. So that's another thing that we are doing as well. Yes?
Just following up on family planning and education in particular, I mean, there's a lot of papers out there that basically say that biodiversity, yes, it's important, but what really matters is functional diversity of species. Would you reckon it is sort of valid to say, well, we'll focus on the ones that are functionally important and, well, sort of surrender with the other ones that we can't rescue anyway?
No, see, like for me, that's giving a value to some certain things, and I value every single species as much as any other species. So, yeah, no, I try to avoid that kind of situation, because if you choose that, then that means that another thing that you have to agree with as well is the value of those biodiversity, right? Because that means then that you have to protect the species that are more valuable, in which case you will lose all the argument to protect all of those species that don't do much on the ecosystem or don't deliver too much money either. So I try to, my view is that ideally you should protect all of the species.
But I mean, somewhere you gotta draw the line, because there is people that do rely on fisheries, on coral reef, for example, and they gotta fish out something.
Yeah, but you can fish them sustainably. And try to if we have very good understanding of how those stocks work there, I believe, I don't know, I mean, we have to still get the science right there, that you can still get some resources there. And that actually is very interesting as well. We had a paper now in the making looking at whether fish will be able to supply the demand that is for fish there. And what you find is that there's just no way that the world's oceans can supply the demand that they are being faced with. And that is also another reason why my opinion has been focused now on human population as an issue. Because if you were to reduce the number of people, keep in mind, I'm not suggesting go and kill people. I'm suggesting it's just, let's plan a long-term solution to this problem to reduce the number of people. Peter Sell and I wrote this paper in MEX, and we had a scenario there in which if every single human being, family couple, were to have one child per couple, you will reduce this problem by the year 2100 to keep at the current capacity of the planet. So it's a long-term problem that I think will be fixed better with family planning than you will do with any other thing, because the simple math is just not adding up. We need a lot of food, and there is just not much of it.
Okay, guys, I think put your hands together for Camilo, and I think just before you do, I think we're going to have lunch, and it'll probably be in between the buildings. So if anyone wants to continue on the conversations, we can meet up for sort of an informal lunch afterwards. So thanks again, Camilo.